You may already know that this is Andrew J. Borden, a wealthy business owner who lived in Fall River, Massachusetts in the late 19th century, and that though his extended family were instrumental in creating the city's textile industry, he actually grew up fairly poor. You may even note that his frugality lasted even when he gained substantial wealth and owned buildings, mills, textile factories, and even the Union Savings Bank. And you definitely know this part, that his youngest daughter, Lizzie, would become the prime suspect in his and his wife's brutal slaying. What you may not know about is the other sister, Emma Borden, the folk tales that caused public discourse around Lizzie to shift, and the events that led to one sister cutting ties completely. This is the untold story of Emma Borden. You see, out of all of the questions that I had about the Lizzie Borden mythos, the murder, the investigation, the trial, the one thing that intrigued me the most about it was the fallout. Not the fallout of the acquittal. Lizzie Borden's mythology is rather interesting, but it was the fallout between the sisters themselves. First of all, though, we need to do a bit of groundwork. Let's go over the murders one more time, and then we'll establish how that affected the sisters in the long run. Now, Emma wasn't actually in Fall River, Massachusetts when the murders took place, so we can safely say that she was never a prime suspect or even considered in the case. So she'll be taking a back seat for the next minute or so. August 4th, 1892, 8:50 a.m. Lizzie descends from her bedroom. She's late up, and the rest of the family have already eaten their breakfast. Just as well, she's never hungry in the mornings. So instead, she decides to heat the iron to do some ironing, as Lizzie's father, Andrew Borden, leaves for work, feeling a little under the weather. Abby Borden, Lizzie's stepmother, asks Bridget, their maid, to wash their windows, so she grabs a bucket and sponge and fills the bucket with water and sets about it. It's during this time when Bridget is out washing windows. Lizzie and her stepmother are alone inside, and at 9:30, Abby Borden is murdered in the guest bedroom upstairs, supposedly whilst changing sheets or fetching supplies to tend to clothing. It's clear in every testimony and court hearing that Bridget was on the outside of the house washing windows at the supposed time of the murders. But it's unclear where Lizzie was. You see, depending on which part of the coroner's inquisition you take as truth, she was either in the basement using the loo, reading a journal or paper in the parlour, or waiting for the iron to heat up in the kitchen. Or you disregard all of that and put her right here at the moment of the crime. Either way, Lizzie is coming down the stairs when Andrew Borden comes home at around 11 o'clock, after visiting a few properties in town. Bridget lets him inside, locks the door, and returns to the windows, washing them from the inside now. Abby's body has still not been found. Lizzie follows her father into the sitting room to ask if any letters had come for her, then leaves him to rest, as the heat seems to be getting to him. Lizzie finds Bridget in a state too, and urges her to rest, so she makes her way to her room on the 3rd floor. Once again, Bridget's absence leads to murder, as it's within this window that Andrew Borden is also killed. A time in which Lizzie would say that she was out in the garden or in the shed looking for iron for around 20 minutes. Lizzie finds the body of her father at around 11:20 a.m. and calls for Bridget. Soon enough, we have neighbours, doctors, police, even press swarming the house. Lizzie is questioned at the scene by police officers, but her recounting of that morning seems uneven, and she would later make more adjustments to that story, leaving her footing even more precarious. Immediately, the newspapers latch onto this. You have have reporters, sleuths, trying to solve the murders for themselves, writing speculation pieces about rising tensions in the family, about estates and housing and transactions between Lizzie and her father, Lizzie and her stepmother. Talk of family disputes about inheritance and wealth. The newspapers had clearly made up their mind about who did the murders, and so had the investigators, as it was here at the Fall River Court building that they questioned Emma and Lizzie, but they questioned Lizzie the most aggressively for 3 days without counsel and without ever informing her that she was a suspect. Emma's role in this inquisition was over fairly quickly, but for the next 3 days she had to watch her sister squirm in her seat as the district attorney tried tying logical knots around her story. And eventually it worked. Lizzie's recountings changed, details missed and were altered the day after next. Although I probably would be a bit traumatized as well, especially if the district attorney was asking me, "Did you see his eyeball hanging out?" That was a real question that they asked someone who hadn't even been informed that they were a prime suspect. Now, this inquisition was actually deemed inadmissible because Lizzie Borden was actually taking enough morphine to affect the memory and change and alter the view of things and give people hallucinations. Was it a stroke of genius to play the fool and blame it all on the drugs? Or was Lizzie simply struggling to deal with the loss of her father and stepmother? In the fallout of the murders, through the funeral, the arrest, and the following trial, Lizzie's sister Emma stood by her side through it all, even when public discourse shifted and it looked certain Lizzie would be found guilty. Emma remained supportive. Which is why I find what happened after the trial infinitely more fascinating than the crime itself. After Lizzie's acquittal, she and Emma bought a house on the Hill. This was the wealthy part of town, situated mere blocks from her previous home. The narrative suddenly changed from a helpless victim backed into a corner by an overbearing father to a resentful spinster who took the lives of her family because she wanted more. To everyone in Fall River, the house, the parties, the guests were all a flaunting of wealth, the wealth that she inherited from her late father. Though I couldn't find any specific accounts of this, the shunning of Lizzie, or Lisbeth as she now went by, must have also extended to her sister Emma. Whispers behind her back, heads turning and gasping in the streets, because to them she was enjoying the spoils of murder. Okay, so Emma stayed by her side through all of this, but what was it that actually drove her to sever ties completely and move out of the house? We know that Lizzie's parties were large, and that on one occasion they hosted for an entire theatre company. But all we get from Emma is that she stayed with her sister until conditions were no longer bearable. So we can assume that it wasn't just a singular event that forced her to make this decision. So maybe we have to dig deeper into their past to find what actually went wrong here, or deeper into their psyche. Sarah Borden died on the 26th of March 1863, leaving behind a 12-year-old Emma and a 3-year-old Lizzie. As she stood by her dying mother's side, Emma vowed to always look after and look out for baby Lizzie. And through studying court transcripts, reading historical interpretations and newspapers, it's clear that Emma did this to the best of her ability, supporting her publicly when she knew it would put a target on her back, and compromising her own boundaries in order to look after her sister. And though you might see this as the average protective older sister characteristic, there might be something deeper going on here, something psychological. In the following section, I'm going to attempt to use a modern psychological lens to reframe how we see the sisters' relationship and try and get a better grasp and understanding of what may have happened. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not saying this is the only way to look at their relationship, but everything, all of my evidence and working will be in the description, so go and read these studies. There are some really great studies in there that could actually help a lot of people. Without further ado, let's talk about parentification. Parentification happens when children are forced to take up excessive responsibilities or adult-like roles long before they are psychologically equipped to handle them. Now, there are two types of parentification, and since the Borden household had a maid, we're going to look specifically at emotional parentification. This type of parentification happens when a child takes on the emotional responsibilities of a caregiver or parent, becoming a pseudo-therapist and confidant, someone who mediates conflict and regulates other people's emotions. And according to a 2023 paper that analysed 95 studies from around the world, most frequently observed negative effect of parentification is depression, followed by anxiety. Now, there are other more severe effects that are related with this, but they're more downstream and they're not related directly. You see, parentification informs attachment styles, which can lead to maladaptive outcomes. For girls especially, it can lead to maladaptive coping strategies, such as emotional suppression, difficulty with self-care, and challenges with setting boundaries. Now let's have a look at how this affects the historical accounts of what we have about the Borden household. Because there is an incident that happened before the murders that I mentioned earlier that is fundamental to understanding the dynamic between these people. This spat, or simply difference of opinion, took place 5 years before Abby and Andrew were murdered. There was a real estate transaction where Andrew Borden bought a house from Oliver Gray, Abby's father, and deeded it to Abby to give to her half-sister. Emma and Lizzie didn't like the idea that Abby had married into the family and their father was just giving away property despite her not being blood related. Not even to them, his own flesh and blood, but to his new wife's half-sister. When asked about this in court, Emma was adamant that she was the one most affected and upset by this, that Lizzie was upset by it as well, but she was the one who confronted their father about it. This resulted in Andrew giving them a property on Ferry Street, which they sold back to their father for $5,000 a month before the murders. Well, how does this link into parentification? Well, in parentification, it's not unlikely to see a parentified child distance themselves from a paternal figure to avoid criticism and re-traumatization. To quote from a 2023 study, the participants who preferred more distance from mothers limited contact to avoid conflict despite the tension of wanting closeness. This is called emotional cutoff. And while this may have been effective in swaying their father in order to give them property, in certain cases the parentified person often struggles with it because they're so enmeshed with their caregiving role. So enmeshed, in fact, that it can hinder the development of a balanced and autonomous sense of self, resulting in relationship patterns that are codependent. And if we look at Lizzie and Emma's relationship, it's not hard to see some form of dependence on each other beyond the typical sisterly love, with Lizzie leaning on Emma for emotional support and guidance, and Emma leaning on Lizzie to provide a sense of identity. A strengthened relationship between siblings as a means of relational coping. Another observed trait is the parentified person acting as a mediator. I want to point out that Bridget, the maid, and everyone else who testified said that there were no underlying tensions in the Borden house. But the evidence is overwhelming that things were uneasy, if not a little cold. For instance, Lizzie called Abby, her stepmother, Mrs. Borden and not mother, despite her being in the house since she was 6 years old as a maternal figure. And the fact that on the morning of the murders, the accounts contain very little in the way of pleasantries or dialogue, so far that the maid does not speak a word when Andrew Borden comes home from work. And the fact that Lizzie's uncle came to stay for the weekend, and despite her being in the house, she never once bothered to greet him. And Bridget's admission of tensions isn't the only lie told under oath. In the case of the housing dispute, I believe that Emma was covering for Lizzie and downplaying Lizzie's aggrievement. Think about everything we've discussed: the sense of duty, the vow to her mother, the unwavering support for her sister. Wouldn't she feel responsible if their father died and suddenly they were left with nothing? She is supposed to protect baby Lizzie. Let's take a look at what happened between Emma and Lizzie Borden after the trial, because this is the most fascinating part. Emma and Lizzie had their large house, the mansion that they dreamed about, fantasized about living in when they were children, with the maids and the coachman. Emma, though, is still grieving the horrific loss of her father. Before long, an air of malaise begins drifting through their new home, as Lizzie's parties and flaunting of their inheritance begins attracting the wrong kind of attention. As is often the case, children like to tell stories about Lizzie, the murderous witch, the folkloric recluse. The tales led to taunting and pranks on the witch that lived inside the house on French Street. Emma is racked with grief, and she's watching her sister become the most hated woman in their hometown. Now let's have a look at some of the conditions that Emma deemed to be unbearable in the lead up to her departure from the house. There were actually a lot of rumours going around at the time, and due to Lizzie's infamous status, word travelled fast. There was a rumour of Lizzie having an especially close relationship with the coach driver, Joseph Tetreault, before his departure from Maplecroft. Emma supposedly didn't like him very much, and in an 1893 article in the Fall River Daily Herald, there was an article describing someone who was pleading guilty to adultery. Emma may have caught wind of his reputation, which led to his eventual dismissal, though it's unconfirmed whether they are the same Joseph Tetreault. Another rumour is about Lizzie's shoplifting, something people had suspected she'd been guilty of before the murders. But there's no hard evidence to prove this. She either stole 2 paintings or statues. Sources vary. One thing we do know, though, is that Lizzie developed a close relationship with actress Nance O'Neill after watching her perform on stage in Boston, sending her flowers along with a letter asking if she may call upon her. In other words, get acquainted. This relationship developed over time, with the two becoming particularly close, holding parties for one another. And Lizzie even helped with the down payment for Nance's summer home in Tingsboro. The rumour here is that Lizzie and Nance O'Neill were more than just friends, though once Emma found out about their romantic involvement, she disapproved, and that's what drove her from the home. This theory is often linked with the idea that Lizzie and Bridget were also in a romantic relationship, and Andrew Borden found out, which is why Lizzie committed the murders, but again, she was never found guilty. Though in an article published by the New Bedford Standard in 1904, they interviewed Nance O'Neill about their relationship, where she said, "I simply felt a great deal of sympathy for her, and a great deal of admiration for the way she carried on. She was always so alone." And that though they were close for the time that she was in the area, when she started touring further afield with the theatre company, they didn't remain in touch, stating eloquently, "They were like ships that passed in the night and speak to each other in passing." But you can see that even after the dust had settled on the official murder case, the sisters could not help but foster a tumultuous household. Even if only some of these were true, or Emma suspected they could be based on Lizzie's past behaviour, it's not hard to see how an older sister may be annoyed at her younger sister's irrepressible behaviour. This tension and bottling up of emotions is congruent with what we see in parentification, where parentified adults may struggle to express their emotions or may bottle up their feelings until they explode in unhealthy ways. Maybe this is what we're seeing when there's a headline about the estranged sisters, a combination of early psychological stresses perpetuated through adolescence and adulthood, elevated by extreme tension and grief. There have been positive effects of parentification, and I want to shed light on some of these because it's something that affects an estimated 1 million carers in the UK alone. Things like empathy, responsibility and problem-solving skills, and emotional intelligence can all have a positive impact on someone's life. But that's all dependent on their experience being seen and validated and supported. If you'd like to support carers affected by parentification, there are plenty of charities in the UK that you can give to, such as Carers Trust, Carers UK, Gingerbread, and Honeypot Children's Charity. They're all doing incredible work. I'll have links to those in the description. Please get what you can. The purpose of this video is not to put forward a definitive theory of what happened between these two sisters, but instead it's a way to look at history through a modern lens, using our abilities that we have now that we didn't have back then. Not to just cast these people as victims or villains of this tragic moment, but to create three-dimensional people that actually existed and contain multitudes. Emma moved out of the house in 1905 and moved to Rhode Island to stay with friends, and then eventually moved to New Hampshire. There was no evidence to suggest that she contacted her sister again before her death at the age of 76, just 9 days after Lizzie's own death. Go on, Ryan Murphy, beat that one.